Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning into our conversation with Chieko Murasugi. I am Kimberly English, the outreach manager here at Black Mountain College Museum and Art Center, and I am delighted to have the opportunity to talk with Chieko today about her recent Instagram takeover and this new body of really outstanding work that she shared with us this week. Chieko is an established artist in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and is the co-founder and co-curator of Basement, which is an artist-run project space that is in Chapel Hill as well. Chieko holds degrees in experimental psychology and in studio art and has exhibited her work widely. Chieko, thank you so much for being here today to chat with me. Do you mind just adding anything that I missed and starting to introduce us to this body of work that you've been sharing?
Um, in terms of what you've missed, I don't know. I think once I start talking about the work, then more you'll learn more about me and how I work and so forth. So yeah, so I guess I'll just jump in and talk about my work. Okay. All right. So the new series of work that I presented at the for my digital residency. I had started just a few months ago, maybe in April, and they were based on my explorations about chance and randomization. But it all started because in my previous work, which uh, they're very complex, big complex paintings that incorporated many elements that were significant in, I'd say, are significant in my sort of worldview. So um, they consist of collage pieces that reference my family history, my Japanese history, or my personal history. Um, they have they incorporate visual illusions, which speak to the notion that things are not necessarily how they seem. That there are several sides to different arguments. There are different aspects to one's identity, different ways of telling a story. So a simple visual illusion to me conveys all of those ideas. And then all these different components are integrated into a very complicated whole, um, which I find which I find very satisfying, because I do find life and humans very complex. But one element that is central to our lives that my paintings have not addressed and that I really wanted to address was this idea of chance. So I think we all have had sort of it's a small world, what a small world moments, or near accidents, or winning things unexpectedly. I mean, things happen, quote, by chance that totally um, you know changes our lives. And so I really wanted to kind of capture this idea of chances and put it in my paintings. And I'm speaking of chance in a very loose way, in sort of the colloquial sense, okay? Because if there's this whole deterministic worldview, which negates the idea of chance, right? That if you had all the initial conditions, if you knew all the initial conditions to an event, or all the antecedents, with that knowledge, you could predict what was coming next, right? So if you know everything, then you know what will happen. And so this determinism can also be conveyed through like a religious standpoint, right? That the all-knowing power, God, could be up there, controlling things. So I am going to just for my for myself, I'm going to say that there's a chance that there is this indeterminacy. So I'm going to be an anti-determinist in this case. Okay, so chance I define loosely, but randomization is something else. Okay, so in my new paintings, I try to grasp or to convey this idea of chance through randomization. And randomization is different from chance in that it has a specific scientific meaning. So throwing a die is a random event. If the die is perfectly fair, and if the thrower doesn't have like a bias, or the surface on which the die is cast is also, say, perfectly level. So I could have, in my new paintings in which I explore randomization, I could have used a die, but I didn't for these factors I just mentioned, because those are all could cause a bias. So in randomization, for all the possible outcomes, the randomized outcomes, there has to be an equal chance, equal probability that each of those outcomes of those outcomes. And so I decided to use a randomization program called random.org that I found on the computer. And in this case, the atmospheric noise, the amplitude of atmospheric noise is the basis for the random digits that they produce. So the assumption is that atmospheric noise is random, and there's a device measuring the atmospheric noise, and that's fed into the computer. And when I ask for randomized numbers from 1 to 6, it measures the atmospheric noise at that moment and uses that to give me my numbers. So that's randomization. And randomization is a notion that is familiar to me as a scientist, because when a scientist runs experiments, let's say they're experimental trials. So I was an experimental psychologist studying visual perception. So I was measuring, I was exploring how humans see color and see motion, and also how monkeys see motion. But in any case, we would present a visual stimulus, and then the subject would have to make a choice. What's this, moving left or right, or up or down, or whatever. And so clearly, when you're presenting the stimulus, they have to be presented randomly. You can't, give them all right direction stimuli and then followed by a bunch of left. You randomize them. And then also when we compile the results, when we analyze the results, the big question is, how likely was this result? How likely was it to occur randomly? And we had to, had a very stringent criterion. So anyhow, so this notion of randomization was very familiar to me, but applying it to art was a different matter.
No, that was great.
But
I think having that distinction between randomization and chance is really important, and maybe something that I haven't necessarily thought about specifically in terms of creation or in making work. But I have a follow-up question to that. You talked about your previous work and really talking about how color informed that previous work. I know that in your takeover, you mentioned influences from BMC. I didn't know if you wanted to talk any more about those influences, or if you wanted to talk about Albers and his study of color and how that informs your work now.
Right. I'm so glad that you brought that up, because color has been really important to me. And in fact, as a scientist, I did my master's thesis on the color vision topic. And Albers, yes, seeing visual illusions such as Albers, his color contrast illusions, for instance, my fascination with that is what drew me into studying visual perception. But Albers, he wasn't a scientist, but there was this methodical, meticulous, incredibly rigorous way in which he explored various color combinations and their effects that I deeply admire. And that kind of single-mindedness on one idea of interest, in his case color, I think is just totally remarkable. And so that kind of focus and that experimental spirit is something that I try to, I try to emulate. But unlike him, I'm interested in too many more things. I'm not as focused as he is, but yes, so I'm constantly thinking about color combinations and how they affect, and the ways that we perceive them. Our brains are very attuned to contrast, to color contrast, to contrast between light and dark, and also edges and shapes. And Albers was very attuned to all of that. And I think that the visual perception, the within the field, there's a huge respect for Albers, and what he contributed to our knowledge of perception. Yeah, and speaking of the Black Mountain College, the people who worked there. I mean, Ruth Azawa was also very influential. Well, first of all, because she was, a Japanese, a woman of Japanese descent, and she was born only a few years before my parents. And so when I think of chance again, I mean, assuming that since she and I were both Japanese, thousands of years ago, we had, maybe we had the same ancestors, say, and somehow, during the Second World War, she was in the United States and interned as even though she was an American-born citizen. And my mother, who like Ruth was very artistic and liked to draw, and she became an artist. But and she was in Tokyo during the war, so they're an ocean apart, similar age, similar ancestry, completely different experiences. Which, of course, so my mother was in Tokyo, and she was escaping the bombing of the Allied forces. And so I think about the chances that she was, just the, this notion that of chance, let's say, that my mother was there in Tokyo, escaping the fires burning down her neighborhood, and Ruth was in an internment camp. And also the fact that my mother escaped the fires by chance, getting on a boat on the Sumida River, which took her to the other side, and she survived, but her father and her sister died, because on the way to the river, my mother took one path and the other family members took another path, and it's just, and that's a story that's part of my family lore. So this idea of luck, chance, fate, whatever, altering lives. In fact, if my mother had died, I wouldn't be here. So these stories, I've heard these stories growing up, and so in the back of my mind, I often think about about that. So yeah, and then in terms of the Black Mountain, there's also John Cage. I mean, I had no idea that he was using randomization to compose his musical pieces until the last few weeks, and he used this Chinese divination tool called I Ching to come up with his numbers. And I don't understand it, but it seems like there are, you can come up with 64 numbers that are randomized, and then he can use those numbers to create his music. But then eventually he moved to computer programs. And the randomization I'm using is very simple in that every number that I choose, like every number could be signify a color, say, or an orientation or whatever I choose in my paintings. And each number has an equal chance of arising from my randomization. But John Cage had way many different algorithms for randomization. So this was the equal possibility randomization, but you can also weight them. You could, if you have numbers from say 1 to 10, you could weight it so that 10 appears, a certain percentage more than the other numbers. And then, or you could have kind of a moving weighting. So for a moment, for a few minutes, the number 10 comes up more. And and then after a little while you wait another number for it to come up more. So I mean, randomization can be very complicated, and he did all that. So that was very, very impressive as well.
Yeah, that's great. I think giving us some kind of insider knowledge of how these cross-disciplinary really iconic people are influencing this body of work. I think that's really valuable. And thank you for sharing all of that. I think we have time for another question. I want to just kind of ask about your personal experience working through this body of work. And I wanted to know if like anything has changed or if as you've discovered through your research or through experimentation, how this body of work is kind of evolving as you work through it, if you want to talk about that.
Right. Yeah. Even though my main body of work is very kind of uses shallow space and there's a sense of patterning. For this work on randomization, I went to pure patterning, at least initially. And because I wanted to, okay, so my end goal is to take something that conveys randomness or idea of chance and incorporate it into my more process-oriented paintings, more intuitive-driven ones. But in order to do that, I felt I had to kind of channel focus my energies on randomization per se. And so I started by juxtaposing in a pattern, like an ordered pattern with randomized elements. So I would take an ordered pattern, okay, and then I would take some of those elements like color orientation and randomize them. And those randomized places would be surrounding the central ordered pattern, or they would be contiguous. And so when I first did that, with my sort of my boat and circle kind of motifs, I found that even though, let's say, the whole surround was randomized, that somehow when the eye looked at these pieces, I didn't see a clear demarcation between the ordered and the not, and the randomized. I mean, that was a surprise to me. I sort of thought that if I randomize the surround in the painting, my eye would say, okay, there's the ordered section, the planned section, there's the randomized section, but it didn't happen that way. And I thought, well, the eye is really resistant to seeing random, or the brain is. We don't look for random. We don't see random very much. And it makes evolutionary sense because, as with our hunter-gatherer brains, we want to be able to spot the leopard predator out in the field, or we want to see the apple tree, amongst, the flowers or whatever. So, our visual systems are very keyed into seeing pattern. And then when my random versus random, non-random pieces, you see them, look at them, instead of seeing the separation, you kind of, I sort of see them as a whole, like with a general pattern that's a little bit altered, say, but the whole thing looks like a pattern. So anyhow, I thought, okay, if I want to convey random and put it next to ordered, I need to do something to really change, separate them. If you separate the random and the non-random even by an inch, then of course you see the two. We merge them. you sort of see them more as one pattern. But another way, other ways that I did sort of in other, subsequent experiments was to change the planes. So I would have, one painting that sort of looked like a hill and, valley and hills. And so there was a planar difference. And if I put the valley, I made the valleys into, made them random, and then the hills non-ordered, then the eye could see the difference. Or change them in plane, like front to back. So in the piece that looks like it has a green fence, the fence comes forward, and the randomized colored areas recede back. So here you have a foreground background demarcation. Or if you change the color, so if the randomized area is the same pattern, is randomized but has a different color from the background, it pops up right away. Whereas the areas that are randomized that have a similar color tend to somehow merge with the background. So there are ways, I'm thinking of sort of spatial ways, formal ways with color, spatially and so forth, to make a distinction between the randomized and the patterned areas, thinking that knowledge would translate, and I can take that knowledge with me, those lessons with me when I make my more complex paintings. And then finally, a couple of things. So the pieces that I've talked about so far have been highly patterned and more or less on a grid. And so I thought, okay, well, what if I take my random elements in a free floating, in a uniform field? What would it look like then? And the two pieces I did, which I call high school biology, I had these round circles, and the X and Y coordinates were randomized. So these round circles, which also varied in size and color, were randomly placed on this blue field. And when I looked at it, I just had this moment of recognition. It reminded me of high school biology class when I looked in a microscope and saw protozoa for the first time. So these one-celled creatures or whatever floating around, and that's what it reminded me of. And I love that because, the composition, the placement of those circles, I have no, it's totally out of my hands, right? In the sense that my intention is gone, my aesthetic is not involved. Right? It's up to this random program to decide where these dots go. And then finally, I was just telling someone that, like Jackson Pollock, when he was making his splatter paintings, drip paintings, he said these are not random. And people say, well, because he had total control over, over his paint. And so I said to someone, so that's not random. What would be random is if I took a piece of paper with some paint on it and put it outside in the rain. Because it's totally hands off, and the rain the water will will drip on the painting in a sort of random fashion. So that's what I've also been exploring. And it's been sunny lately, so I haven't had much of a chance to go out there. And thinking, well, maybe I should just put stuff under, a piece of paper with paint on it under a shower. But I'm still hoping for some rain. So it goes on and on. One idea leads to another. But the end point is that I'm hoping that what I learn about how to convey randomness in a two-dimensional painting, how I can incorporate that into my work of which conveys more of the complex, all the components of our complex lives.
Yeah, Chieko, thank you so much. That was really amazing. I think just I could listen to you talk about this body of work for a long time. And I think having this kind of contextual knowledge to go back and revisit the work is really, really great, and super valuable. So I think that's actually a really good stopping point. If there's anything else you want to add, Chieko, please feel free.
Well, thank you. Thank
Oh
you
my gosh.
so much, Kimberly. I can't tell you that, this is, it's, it's a new body of work.
Mm,
And I look at this work as a bunch of little experiments. And because unlike my other work, I can make a painting in a few days instead of a month or a few weeks. And and I just love sort of kind of talking to you almost in real time, as if in progress.
mm,
I can talk. I'm able to. I have a venue. I have
mm.
of sort of communicating my thoughts as they evolve, and sharing this work as it evolves.
Yeah,
And that's super exciting because generally, you know, we show works that are finished,
yeah,
and then we have had time to process them and think about their significance and so on. And I haven't had that time
yeah.
really. So there's a sense of, so it's exciting. Um, and yeah, and I've just been really loving it.
Awesome.
I'm
Well, yeah, thank you
learning so
so
much as
much.
I go.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much for sharing all that you did with us. I think that's kind of the hope for this takeover is that it feels like a little bit less pressure and that you have more of a community to talk things through and to express your ideas in a way that's not in a white cube.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I'm glad that you found some value in it. We certainly did. Yeah, everyone, I encourage you to look at Chieko's work. We're going to drop her website at the title card at the end of the video and to go back and look at her Instagram takeover at BMC Museum on Instagram. Thank you so much, Chieko. Thanks for sitting down and chatting with me.
Thank you so much. It's been great.